Good morning. We are going to be moving on to our next unit that deals with drugs and alcohol. So first thing we're going to look at is the use of drugs, whether that be illicit or over the counter. So a drug would be classified as any natural or synthetic substance that is designed to affect the individual psychologically or physiologically. So if you consider caffeine would be considered a drug because your overall desired goal is to be a heightened awareness to excite your body, to awaken yourself up so that you're ready to go for the day. So technically, caffeine would fall into that. So anything that has caffeine, chocolate, pop, coffee, would fall into it as a technical drug. Now, not all drugs, obviously, because caffeine is not one that is a controlled substance, falls under the classification by the federal government as a controlled substance. In 1970, the federal government went ahead and created a list that said these are all the drugs that are illegal, and they classified them into different categories. And based upon those categories, they started to assign whether or not there's a potential for high abuse or low abuse, if there's any medical use or no medical use. And then also assigned a penalty if you were caught with possessing the drug or also trying to distribute it to sell it. So there are different levels, level 1, schedule 1, all the way down to schedule 5. Schedule 1 is the worst of all. Those are going to be any type of drug that has high potential for abuse and we have no acceptable medical use, all the way down to schedule 5, which has a low potential for abuse, but it does have medical use here in the United States. So you might be wondering, well, what drugs would fall into each of those categories? So obviously you see the wide range. You can also see whether there are some severe psychological or physical dependence to that drug. So here's some different ones. So Schedule 1, heroin, LSD, marijuana. Yes, marijuana is still in Schedule 1. Schedule 2 would be cocaine, morphine. A lot of people say, oh, well, morphine, don't they use that in hospitals? They do as a painkiller, but if we are using it for pleasure, then it turns into an illicit drug. So yes, it is used medically, and it is acceptable for that. But anytime that you start using a prescription drug for your own desired results, which would be for pleasure or anything like that, then it turns into an illicit drug. All the way down to Schedule 5. Schedule 5, in cough medicines, you do have codeine. So you might notice some things that you get that are over the counter, you do have to show an ID for. And you have to do that because of the levels of codeine that you can find in some of these medicines. All right, so you might be wondering, why is marijuana Schedule 1? Because obviously there's a huge debate whether or not marijuana should be legalized or not. Some states have legalized recreational use of marijuana, whereas other states are strictly medical use for marijuana, and then others completely outlaw it, so you're not allowed to use it recreationally or illegally. So in 2020, they had deemed it the year of legalizing cannabis. However, because of COVID and the election, that's kind of gotten pushed off the table, and they've been focusing on the pandemic. But they were looking at changing the classification of marijuana as a Schedule 1 and taking it out so that it could be a recreational drug. So here, if you take a look across the board, we have the ones that are in gray are completely illegal. You're not allowed to have any type of marijuana, whether that's medicinal or recreational. Dark green, we do have legalization for recreational use. So if you see, there are only a few states that allow it recreationally. Ohio does fall in to the category where you can use it medically. So if you take a look, depending upon how much you have in your possession, you could actually have a penalty that's about $150 all the way up to $20,000, depending upon how much of marijuana that you actually have. It depends on the intent. Are you using it recreationally for yourself, or are you planning on selling it? And then also trafficking. Are you taking it from city to city or even state to state? The moment it goes state to state, it does turn into a federal case. because you're going between jurisdictions and you're not within the same state. So you can see the different penalties, whether it be classified as a misdemeanor, which is one of our lowest level, upwards to a felony, which would be the most serious. All right, so the different categories of our drugs include hallucinogens, stimulants, narcotics, depressants. I talked about caffeine before, how it kind of stimulates you, it wakes you up. A hallucinogen causes the hallucinations. That would include LSD, PCP, marijuana, ecstasy. Narcotics, which would be analgesics, those are ones that actually relieve some pain, so aspirin, Motrin, Tylenol. Remember, we said this includes both over-the-counter and illicit drugs. Depressants does include alcohol. So when we look at some of the people who are taking drugs recreationally for pleasure, they may be abusing alcohol, which can make them kind of sad and slow down their body, slow down their heart rate, slow down their breathing. And then they take a stimulant to kind of bring them back up. So that's what they would call the uppers, so that they get themselves back going in again. So when you look at a lot of different party drugs, if you're mixing alcohol and party drugs, you're kind of doing the opposite. One is a depressant and the other would be a stimulant. So again, illicit drugs versus over-the-counter. Over-the-counter, you do not have to have a prescription for. Those would be like Tylenol, Motrin, aspirin, whereas an illicit drug would be a drug that you take for pleasure. So again, this is going to be all the big name ones that you know of: marijuana, heroin, cocaine, but a drug that you get as a prescription can also be abused and be taken for pleasure, like oxycodone or oxycontin, and that then becomes an illicit drug because you are taking it for pleasure. So when out in the field, when they're trying to identify the different types of drugs, they can run a couple different tests. They can actually consider field tests, which would be a presumptive test, which usually that's color. So they'll have a certain chemical reagent that they'll use that on the white powder and see what color result they get. Depending upon the chemical structure of the actual drug, it'll generate different colors. And so that can help a cop or forensic scientist quickly identify what this may possibly be, but then they would have to run more conclusive tests in the lab in order to determine the exact chemical structure of the drug. So again, that presumptive test is what I was talking about. It's a quick little spot test that allows for us to see specifically what color is being produced after reacting with a reagent. Or we can do confirmatory tests, which is usually what we do after we have a positive presumptive test. We could run UV or infrared spectra or a mass spectrometer as well. And so I'll show you a picture of what that means here in a second. So here are some different reactions. You can see over here to the right in our picture where we have different drugs that are within each of these chemical wells. And then if we use different colored reagents like Marquis, Delicopiani, the DKNL, Van Urk, or the Scott's test, it's going to generate a certain color for a certain illicit drug. So for example, the Scott test turns cocaine blue, whereas the Marquis turns purple in the presence of opium and orange-brown with amphetamines. So each of these are going to generate different colors. And again, just a quick little spot test for some of our law enforcement and first arrivers to be able to identify the substance. So in the picture over on the right, that is a mass spectrometer that allows for us to be able to look at the different components of the drug and say chemically what would be the organic structure. If any of you guys have taken AP Chem or Honors Chem last year, you guys probably got into organic chemistry and looking at the structure of molecules. So depending upon the actual structure, it will separate out. So here, this is very similar to the paper chromatography that we did. It separates out into the different components. So you can see that either on paper chromatography, or you can also do it with infrared. And where you see each of those different dips, each dip represents a different functional group on the organic structure. Now, the nice thing is you would never have to memorize this, but you would have a big book of knowns. And so you would put the substance into the machine and it would spit out this image. And then you would just match it up to other known substances. Same deal with mass spectra. You see different peaks for each of the different functional groups. Each chemical substance will have its own unique mass spectra. So again, you would just have a nice solid book of knowns, and you would get the printout and you would run that test and then compare it to that known. Okay, so both of them do a really good job at trying to identify pure substances. However, if you do have a substance that is mixed, it's a little bit harder for scientists to be able to identify specifically what chemical compounds are within that substance. So if you've ever heard them talking about that the heroin or the cocaine was laced with fentanyl, that means they're adding in other drugs to that powder. And then that powder, when they take it, has not just heroin in there. So they may be buying heroin on the street, but it may also be laced with fentanyl. So you might be thinking, all right, where does this factor in with forensics? So obviously, if we have a deceased individual, we can go ahead and collect different samples, or it may also be somebody that committed the crime that we have arrested and we want to collect a sample. Maybe that's blood, urine, in order to identify if they are on a drug or if there was something placed inside their drink. Or you can also look at the body postmortem. So we can look at the stomach to see if any pills or were ingested. We can look at the liver because the liver mainly filters out toxins from the blood. So that's a pretty good job in order for us to analyze toxicology hours before somebody's death. You can also look at the bile, that is looking at the toxicology within the past 3 to 4 days. The vitreous humor, I know this is going to sound really gross, but that's going to be the fluid within your eyeball. For individuals that are badly decomposed, this is probably one of the final fluids that is remaining as that body's decaying. Hair provides a pretty good timeline for poisoning. We can also look at hair when we're looking at drug use over a long extended period of time. Again, as long as they don't shave their whole head, we know that that drug is going to be present at about 1 centimeter every month. So if I find presence of a drug 5 centimeters down, then they were using that drug 5 months ago. We can also look at insects that begin to consume the decaying corpse. We can look at the toxic levels found within those. All right, so a couple terminologies that I need you guys to know. Antipyretic is a fever reducer. Analgesic is a pain reliever. And then an NSAID is a non-steroidal anti-inflammatory drug. So we're going to be doing a couple labs coming up where we are looking at over-the-counter as well as illicit drugs. And we say, okay, well, what is the difference between the two? How are they used? Do they have similar properties? For example, if you have a headache, you're probably going to ask, hey, do you have Tylenol, to see if you can take it to relieve that headache. But when you say Tylenol, you might actually mean Tylenol, or you may mean ibuprofen or Motrin or Aleve. All of them are going to work in a very similar function to relieve that pain. All right, so looking again further at toxicology. Toxicology is our study of the adverse effect of chemicals and physical agents on living organisms. So that may include drugs and alcohol, but it could include other areas, like considering environmental. We live out by a very rural community, and so chemicals are constantly being put on the land and the soil, and then it rains and you can have some of that runoff go into the water. So you could look at contamination in air, water, or soil and see what impact that is having on people. You could look at consumers having different types of chemicals, things that are causing illnesses or sickness with different types of foods, cosmetics, or drugs. We can look at the medical, clinical, or forensics route as well. So when we consider toxicology, that may be the cause of death. It may contribute to an individual's death. So for example, the alcohol may not have killed the individual, but the person driving their vehicle while under the influence, that would be contributing to the death. It could cause an impairment, which that would also line up with that as well. Same with marijuana. It's going to cause some impairment, and that's why you're not allowed to drive or operate heavy machinery while under the influence. or it could explain their behavior. So why were they acting irrational in their final moments of life? So this could actually play in when we're looking at the defense as well. So one defense might be that, well, they were under the influence and they are a good person. They wouldn't normally do this. But under the influence of the drugs, it was the drug that caused them to behave this way. So when we're looking at toxicology, this is important for not only the prosecutor, but also the defense attorney. All right, so lethal dose, we're looking at what is the level or how much of the substance would have to be consumed that would kill half our test population within 4 hours. So pretty much how much are you going to take in order for somebody to die? And so we would want to be really, really careful with that. Obviously, that's going to factor in when we start looking at pain relievers being prescribed for people. What is the dosage of the ibuprofen that you should be taking? Because you shouldn't be exceeding those 200 or 400 milligrams within the 6 hours. But I know some of you guys probably take more than 1 or 2 ibuprofen when you have a bad headache. If you think all the way back to Mount Carmel, if you remember, this was in the news not too long ago, one of the doctors was prescribing fentanyl, which is used as a pain reliever. He was prescribing fentanyl at such a high level, tons and tons of people were dying. Okay, so again, if you exceed that lethal dose, then you're going to see a high death rate. All right, so when we look at what federal agencies are involved with drugs, toxicology, alcohol, these are going to be the different ones that have regulatory agencies. So obviously Food and Drug Administration would fall into there. Environmental, the EPA, Protection Agency, because remember we said it's not only what chemical are you putting in your body, but it's also what chemical may be entering your body without you even knowing it. So with the soil that you're coming into contact with, the water that you are drinking locally, is it being treated and able to take out some of those things that are toxic? So if you look at EPA, Flint, Michigan, we found a large amount of lead within the drinking water. Department of Transportation, Occupational Safety and Health Administration as well would fall into those different categories. So if we look at different symptoms of poisoning, all of these items can be purchased or collected from different businesses. So sulfuric acid, hydrochloric acid we use at the pool a lot. So just some of those different symptoms that can help us identify that we might actually have a poisoning take place. If you have different colored vomits, again, weird odors, obviously the diarrhea, the vomiting, the nausea, all are going to be pretty good indicators that you're pretty sick. And it's probably a little bit more than just regular food poisoning. All right, so again, we can analyze several of the same items that we had talked about earlier in the SNOS presentation. You can collect samples from blood, urine, the vitreous humor of the eye, bile. Your stomach contents is the gastric contents, liver, brain, tissue, hair, nails. Okay, so surprisingly enough, alcohol is a drug. Okay, remember we had said that anything that causes a change in physical or psychological state would be classified as a drug. Alcohol is the most abused drug in America. About 40% of all of our traffic deaths are alcohol related. Okay. Now, I am sure I'd be interested to see if that number has changed since the invention of Uber and Lyft and all these ride-sharing programs, because you see less and less people when they're drinking going out and then bringing themselves back home. So chances are you do see a reduction in that number, hopefully, with these cheaper alternatives for ways to get home rather than a traditional taxi. It is toxic. It does affect the central nervous system, including the brain. Typically, it is a colorless liquid. Generally, we dilute it in water. It is a depressant. Within minutes of drinking, you're going to find alcohol within the bloodstream. About 30 to 90 minutes later, you tend to see full absorption. Most of the detoxification is going to occur in the liver, and about 5% of the alcohol actually gets excreted unchanged in breath, perspiration, and urine. So how fast your body actually absorbs that alcohol is dependent upon a handful of things. Obviously, the amount of alcohol consumed, the alcohol content of the beverage. So if you're looking at, say, a beer is typically anywhere from 3 to 6% alcohol, whereas when you look at wine is greater than that, and then even more than that would be liquor. How long it took to consume it. So for example, if you're drinking one beer at dinner, and so it's over 30-40 minutes versus drinking one beer in 1 minute, the absorption rate is going to be a lot faster the quicker that you actually drink it. Whether or not there's food present in the stomach after or during the point in which you are consuming that alcohol can also affect how quickly the body absorbs alcohol. The more food that you have in your stomach, it absorbs more of that alcohol, so it doesn't go directly into the bloodstream as fast. Whereas if you drink on an empty stomach, you would consider that body absorbing the alcohol faster. So you start feeling those physiological effects a lot quicker. Also, depending upon the consumer, their height, their weight, their gender can impact the rate of absorption as well. So you've probably heard of the BAC, the blood alcohol content level. You know that the legal limit is 0.08. So in order to calculate the blood alcohol content level, at about 0.02, you're starting to feel something. At 0.04, there is a sense of relaxation. At 0.06, you're less able to make rational decisions. Driving can become impaired. At 0.08, you're considered to be intoxicated and are not allowed to drive. At 0.12, vomiting may occur. At 0.15, balance is compromised. At 0.4, you can lose consciousness and death may occur. And at 0.45, most people stop breathing and die. So I know as you guys start getting older and you're looking at going to colleges, alcohol, again, is very prevalent on college campuses. And so once you guys are of the legal limit and you are 21, you have to be very, very careful how much you are drinking and how quickly you are drinking, because most people forget this, but it is a depressant, which means it's going to slow things down. So that means your breathing and your heart rate will also slow down. So it is possible for you to drink yourself to death. Okay? All right, that's my public service announcement for today. You can calculate that whether you're a male or a female by taking 0.071 times the number of ounces that you consumed times the percent of alcohol, and then divided by the total body weight. Your body typically burns off at a percent of 0.015% per hour, but that can also vary. Just like we had said, with the rate of absorption, it also varies. When looking at calculating the volume, how much you can drink, if you take the weight of the person who is consuming times the blood alcohol, desired blood alcohol content, which should be less than the 0.08 because that would be the legal limit, and then divide it by 3.78 for men and 4.67 for women. So looking at the blood. All right, so again, different field tests that we can do. We can do a quick little preliminary test. Those are going to be the ones, can you walk a straight line, tap your nose, look back and forth, okay? So that allows for us to do a quick determination whether or not you have been drinking. Obviously, the smell of the person, how they are acting, what they are saying is going to clue the officer in that this person may be under the influence of alcohol. There is no, can you say the ABCs backwards? Okay, so that is not an actual field test that they do. They do follow a pen left and right. They have them walk forwards and turn, and they have them do the one leg stand. Okay. Here again is an individual actually taking a breathalyzer test, and when you go ahead and do the breathalyzer test, you have to blow into this little tube for an extended period of time, and then the device will actually read back the blood alcohol content level. Here would be, again, using our fingers, tapping back and forth, maintaining balance. Typically, you'll also see them lift one foot as well. I don't know if any of you guys were here when we did the mock crash a couple years ago, but the officer said one of the most important things is not that you're able to complete the task perfectly, which you should be able to, but I know I'm always like, I can't really walk straight. My balance isn't that great. And he had said, well, the biggest thing is, are you able to follow instructions? So he was talking at lunch, we did similar to these tests. So kids got to put on the goggles that simulated them being under the influence, and then they had to try to walk the straight line. And he was giving them instructions about what they're supposed to be doing with their arms, what they're supposed to be doing with their eyes. And usually that is one of the things that individuals struggle with, is following those clear instructions. So again, forensic toxicology, we can look at it in terms of post-death, so post-mortem. So this would be the medical examiner or coroner would be analyzing those contents in the stomach, looking at the liver, looking at the vitreous humor. Criminal, this could factor in if there is an accident. They're probably going to be looking not only were you texting and driving, but maybe were you under the influence of alcohol or drugs. In terms of the workplace, a lot of workplaces do drug testing, and that might be just a pre-employment drug test, or it might be random drug tests throughout your employment. I know when I worked for the city of Hilliard, every year at the beginning of our summer, we would have to have a drug test. And then if, for example, you were using a city truck and you got in a car accident, the very first thing they'll have you do is go take another drug test. Because if you get in an accident in a city car and you're under the influence, you will not be covered. Whereas if you get in a car accident and you are not under the influence, then you're completely covered, and they will support you through the process of filing those auto claims, paying for any injuries, things like that. Sports, this might be important, especially if we're looking at individuals using performance enhancement drugs. So if you think all the way back to Russia in the most recent Olympics, all of their individuals were not allowed to compete because of a doping scandal that occurred with their doctors and a majority of their athletes. The athletes that did pass the drug test, though, were able to compete under, I forget what flag it was. It was like a general Olympic flag. It did not represent any country. And then again, environmental, industrial, catastrophic, terrorism, things like that can factor in too. All right, guys, have a great one.